You wouldn't hit a lady, would you? Hello, my name is Will, and this is Exploding Helicopter, the podcast looking to put $5,000 on Mally No Show. Now, between 1968 and 1986, Clint Eastwood was always one of Hollywood's top 10 box office stars. That's right, for 19 consecutive years, Old Squint and the films he starred in were always among the biggest moneymakers with American audiences. And if you look at the data, Eastwood's popularity is even more extraordinary. Whether it's Stallone or Schwarzenegger, Harrison Ford or Burt Reynolds, no other actor in the last 60 years has come close to matching either the longevity or the year-in, year-out nature of his success. So on this show, we're going back to 1977, a year when the former mayor of Carmel ranked as the third biggest star of the American box office, to review The Gauntlet. Joining me to discuss the film is a man you can always rely on to get the job done. It's my good friend Nick Rehak. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, man. How are you?
Yeah, I am very well, thank you. Very well. And pleased to be talking Clint Eastwood with you. Now, as I have mentioned in my intro, he's a hugely popular actor, as I've sort of hopefully demonstrated. But the key question for me, Nick, is he popular with you?
Oh, he was very big in the Rehak household growing up. My father is a big Clint Eastwood fan, so growing up, it was, every possible Clint Eastwood Western you could imagine, I watched it growing up. The big one for me, though, was always The Outlaw Josie Wales. That's my favorite thing that he's ever done, period. I think it's a phenomenal and outstandingly underrated Western that deserves a whole lot more love than what it gets.
Okay. And you'd mentioned you've seen a lot of Clint Eastwood films before. Had you seen this one before?
I had not. I'd never heard of it until I had the email come through from you, and I was like, oh, okay, something new to add to the list, because nothing. This was good. And then part of me is like, is it part of like the Dirty Harry films that I miss it? And then looking at it, I'm like, nope, not at all like the Dirty Harry films.
And what do you've spoken about sort of films he starred in, but what have you made, if anything, of sort of Clint Eastwood, the director?
I overall like him as a director. I think he's able to do things and have different points of view that are nice and refreshing. He does that in this film. He's done that in a handful of films. But it's interesting, the topics and like what he's worked on. Like at first, he was kind of doing like some, cop and cowboy type stuff, and then you see it shift to like really just cowboy or really just like cop stuff, and then it gets into now he's doing just anything that was like based on a true story type stuff. So to see his shift and where his focus has been like really interesting. But for the most part, I'm not going to say I enjoy everything that he's put out, but I enjoy it more often than not.
I'd kind of agree with you there, Nick. And I actually think that sort of Clint Eastwood, the director, has got more interesting as he's got older. And I think if you start sort of looking at that run of films that he's made in like the 2010s and maybe even back to the noughts as well, there are some sort of thematic. Well, there's some themes that just sort of keep cropping up again and again in those films, and I don't think Clint Eastwood is up there with the sort of he shouldn't be up there on the sort of Mount Rushmore of American directors, but he's got a filmography that I think is worthy of like some academic scrutiny for no other reason at all. I mean, the longevity of his directorial career is just bonkers. I mean, he's directed like over 40 films in a pretty much sort of 55-year career, like behind the camera. I mean, there are other people who are just known just as directors who haven't even directed that many films or haven't been able to sustain a career over that amount of time.
No, I mean, Tarantino's done 9 films. He says he's going to do one more and that's it. And it's like, okay. But then if you look at Clint Eastwood, and the 50 plus he's pumping out. And it's not like a Woody Allen kind of thing, right? Where one comes out every year and it's about, a character that it's like, thinks he's really smart, but he has all these flaws. And it's kind of a rinse and repeat kind of thing. These are, while they might deal in similar topics, you know what I mean? If there's, deal with law enforcement or, Westerns or even the military, there's still different enough stories within to where it doesn't feel like he's treading the same ground over and over. Like you couldn't put Mystic River, Absolute Power, and like Blood Work, right? You couldn't put, they're all like law enforcement type movies, but it's not like they're the exact same thing. Like they're still very different. And then he'll go and do something like The Bridges of Madison County alongside like Unforgiven, and then something even newer. What's the one he did with Matt Damon? Invictus, the rugby thing. And it's just like there's nothing he won't tackle or he did Jersey Boys, for goodness sake. Like
exactly.
There's nothing he won't do. And occasionally you catch a dud. You know what I mean? The one where the train movie in Paris, that one, not great. But every so often, I think you got to have a dud to appreciate and to make up for all the other kind of fantastic films that he has out there.
Okay, I think it's time to get stuck into The Gauntlet. So let's listen to a trailer voiced by Shaggy from Scooby-Doo.
He's a cop and she's a girl who's been around. But it looks like someone doesn't want him to make it. The word is out to stop him. The odds are 100 to 1 they won't get through, but there's no way they're going to give up. Clint Eastwood, The Gauntlet, rated R.
The Gauntlet was directed by Clint Eastwood. He stars in it alongside his then girlfriend and regular on-screen partner Sondra Locke. Aside from that, there aren't any really other famous names in the cast, although there are a lot of familiar faces. So you've got people like Pat Hingle, who's perhaps best known for playing Commissioner Gordon in a couple of the Batman films, and Bill McKinney. The film was written by Michael Butler and Dennis Chirac, who worked as a screenwriting double act, and most importantly to Exploding Helicopter fans, they penned the Canon-produced action flick 50/50 that we reviewed previously on this podcast. The Gauntlet was a box office success. It was the 14th highest grossing film that year. It's got a 6.4 rating on IMDb and a 3.2 out of 5 rating on Letterboxd. So with all of that out of the way, Nick, what did you make of The Gauntlet?
This was something else. This very much caught me off guard. I was not expecting this at all. I'm thinking like, okay, at some point it's gonna make sense. At some point, we're gonna be in reality, and we're not gonna be stuck in this fantasy world that we're living in. And it didn't happen, and it just kept escalating and escalating. And I don't know if I thoroughly enjoyed it, or if I absolutely loved it, or if I found it dreadful. I really don't know where I fall with this movie. I watched it twice because I watched it, and then I'm thinking, I'm like, let me form a solid opinion. I just don't want to be down the middle of the road on it. And I watched it again, and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this movie, because there are truly some crazy things. There's also some terrible things, and there's also some very inventive and exciting things, and it all just kind of mushes together into this film that I can't make heads or tails of. I'm so just like it's someone they read the script and were like, this is going to be great, and then they put it to film, and a lot of people were like, nope, no notes. let's go ahead and put it out.
Okay,
I couldn't. Oh.
Let's break that down a little bit. So what were the exciting bits?
The exciting bit, well, I think the most exciting bit for me is the exploding helicopter action, but obviously we're going to touch on that later, so we'll pause that for now. But it's just shootout after shootout and car chases, and leading up to the exploding helicopter, an incredibly long chase between the helicopter and Clint on a motorcycle. And it just goes and goes. And some of these camera angles and decisions he makes, I found like really fascinating. I mean, there's a moment where the camera's following them on a motorcycle, and then for like a couple seconds, it just decides to follow the shadow of the helicopter for a little bit. There's a moment during the chase where they drive into a tunnel, and the way the lighting is set up, it makes it look like, here comes this helicopter creeping around like it's Jaws or something like that. Like there's some really inventive camera work here, and it makes it exciting because it doesn't feel like the same kind of boring shots over and over again. And this is a film from, what'd you say, 77?
Yeah.
So for a film from 77 to still weirdly feel fresh and new, for me is like kind of exciting. And I think it's partial due to like Clint's directive eye, because he's doing, it looks a lot like, to me, he's taking elements of the Western and putting it onto film like this. These long drawn out shots of him just like kind of riding along. It'd be no different than watching a guy on a horse, riding across the plains.
Yeah.
And just to have a lot of that kind of carryover made for a visually appealing film, even when the story and even some of the acting was a little like too much or not enough.
Okay, well, you're on a roll, so I'm going to keep going with this. So you've mentioned some of the exciting, you've mentioned some of the inventive. What was some of the terrible for you?
Oh, some of the terrible for me was I like Sandra Locke in Outlaw Josie Wales. I like her in that film, and to see her as this character, I'm like, okay, there's a little bit of familiarity, and there's also like something a little fresh and new there. But I felt like this film was just so mean. Like it was just mean-spirited through and through. Like there's the scene when they're in the cave and they're just talking about how they just want to beat each other up. And that's the nicest way of putting it compared to what he said he would do for just 2 pennies and a stick of gum. I'm just like, like this, what a bunch of ugly characters. Like, what am I rooting for these people for? There's no like redeeming. I can understand if he's like an anti-hero from the outset. And we don't really get that. We see Clint Eastwood's character, Detective Shockley. He's kind of getting out of a bar and he's drunk and he's just going straight to work to get his assignment. And it's like, okay, dude's got some demons and, he's had a tough life. And or maybe, who knows, maybe we'll get a backstory or something like that, and we just kind of follow him along. But then like some of the stuff he says and he's doing, I'm just like, yeesh. Like I kind of don't care if she makes it at this point. Like I just want to know if anyone is going to live and survive this thing.
Well, I'm going to put my cards on the table because you've done a lot of talking, and you probably need a breather right now. But I think I'm in slightly similar territory to yourself, because I mean, This is. I think overall, I would say the Gauntlet is quite a slight, undemanding film. I mean, it's very easy to enjoy because, as you say, there's lots of action. Clint Eastwood is being Clint Eastwood in this, and what's not to enjoy about that? But the minute you start, I don't know, thinking about this film, lots of questions start coming up into your mind, like what on earth. Like, what sort of sense are we to make of Clint's character? Like, why does he put himself through all this to get like Sandra Locke from A to B? Why is he putting his life in jeopardy? I mean, that whole thing with his character being an alcoholic, that's forgotten within about 10 minutes of the movie starting, and it doesn't play into another aspect of the movie. So, like, what the hell was the point of all that about? And then there are, as you say, there is a sort of nastiness to this film that if you start sort of scrutinizing it, you just, it moves beyond just, okay, that sort of classic 2 characters, they're chalk and cheese, they're going to bicker, and, eventually they're going to, I don't know, come to some sort of understanding by the end of the movie. There's some genuinely weird scenes in this film where there's a level of sort of like nastiness to them that you think, okay, why is this here? Where's it going? And I don't know, for my money, those scenes weren't going anywhere. I mean, the one that really sticks out to me in terms of that is that scene where where Clint and Sandra Locke have taken that sort of cop kind of policeman hostage, and he's driving them to the Arizona border, and the cop is for sort of unknown reasons, just really antagonizing Sandra Lott by like asking her what it's like to be a prostitute, and she's giving him various degrees of mouthful, and then she says to him, does your wife know that you masturbate? At which point the cop freaks out and just I think he crashes the car or something. Then and it's just like what the hell was that scene all about? Because it goes on forever.
Yeah, and it's one of those things I'm like, we could have cut this. Like, we could have easily just had a really quick boom, it's nightfall, and everybody's frustrated at each other because they've been stuck in a car all day. Like, it doesn't need to get into that territory. And I'm like, why are we developing this character like this? These two both hate each other, and then magically she's like, you kind of saved my life, I love you now. And it's like... what are you talking about? Then there's this weird phone conversation she has with her mom, and she's like, yeah, I met this guy, we're going to get married and do all this stuff. And I'm like, where is this coming from? Because at no point, except for like a brief moment in a hotel room where she's like, lean back like mama take care of all this. I'm like, what are you talking about? You go from you're hyperventilating, trying to kill me in this ambulance to now I'm like all about you. And I'm so confused by her character. I'm like, I don't know what her motivations are. I don't know what she wants. Should we be like cheering and rooting for her, or should we be concerned? Like, I don't know. And then there's that really intense scene in the train car where she kind of like offers herself up as a bit of a sacrifice. And I'm just like, is this really going to happen right now? Like, is this what we're getting into? And, thankfully things take a bit of a turn and it doesn't go fully where you think it would. But it's still these really just intense moments of like, why? And confusion. And I don't get it. It felt like they were starting an idea with the script and then just kind of got away from it. Like you mentioned, him and his drinking. Like we see that first thing in the film, and then we see him later like knocking back like a little fifth or a little bottle of something, but it's never like really addressed outside of that. Like she calls him some names and stuff, but it's they start something and then they just don't follow through or they don't finish it.
Exactly, and it's a film that you can watch very easily and not think about it because it just looks like a million other films that you've seen before. Well, maybe not looks, but the kind of the plot lines is like a million other films that you've seen before. So it's all very familiar, and yeah, there's no reason for these two characters to suddenly start looking like they're going to have like some sort of relationship together. Yeah, you can enjoy it, but as soon as you start scrutinizing it, it just comes across as a sort of very deeply weird film. And I was thinking about like these sort of things that go nowhere and these undeveloped plot points, and I was thinking, well, maybe if it had been a longer film, they could have got stuck into some of that stuff. And then I double checked the running time. It's 1 hour and 49 minutes long, so there was plenty of time to develop the characters. They just didn't choose to do that. I mean, it doesn't feel like a near 2 hour film. I mean, it feels like it goes by very quickly, very enjoyably. I mean, before I looked it up, if you'd asked me, I would have probably said it's like 90 minutes, 95 minutes max. 1 hour 49, and I was like, how on earth is this film? How come so many parts of this film are so flimsy when actually they had plenty of time to develop stuff in what's really a very basic, simple, straightforward story?
Yeah. And it's almost as if they get ready to develop a character and then they're like, you know what? Let's just unload 1,000 rounds into a car instead. And it's like, oh, okay, let's go do that. Like, let's go overboard. The film either is too soft, and when I say soft in the sense that they're not really taking any chances to develop a character fully or for you to understand them better, to give them backstory or flesh them out, or they go incredibly hard where they're unleashing just gallons and gallons and buckets of bullets into cars or into buses or just crazy shootouts or ambulance chases. Like they push for that, and it's like, okay, now let's find a tonal balance and maybe edit this together properly and figure it out, instead of making us wonder like, okay, what's it for? Or is this all just like thin plots in order to get to these particular set pieces they wanted to do? I'm confused at kind of what they wanted to do with this movie. Now,
you mentioned that you are a big fan of The Outlaw Josie Wales, and that features Clint Eastwood and Sandra Locke as an on-screen couple once again. Now, I don't know if you sort of saw this in any research that you did for this film, but the Gauntlet, when it was conceived, Eastwood and Locke weren't originally intended as the stars of the film. So originally, it was meant to feature Marlon Brando and Barbra Streisand.
What?
And it was then going to feature Steve McQueen and Streisand before eventually ending up with Eastwood and Locke. So, yeah, I wondered do either of those other combination of actors excite you when you think of the Gauntlet, perhaps as in an alternate universe?
The Marlon Brando is befuddling. I don't know. I do not see him in this role. At all. Not for a split second. I mean, you can't go from The Godfather to this and then Apocalypse Now. You can't do that. You have to. No. Now, Steve McQueen, I'm kind of leaning more in his camp and seeing him as this character, mainly for, we know what he can do with cars and motorcycles. We know he can handle himself in a gunfight. I think he would be a very deft hand with a role like this, and it would work. Streisand, on the other hand, I'm ambivalent when it comes to her work. I'm not going to go out of my way to see something she's in, but if she's in something I'm watching, I'm not going to turn it off or anything. So she... I'm okay whether she is or isn't in it, but the Steve McQueen thing for sure interests me.
Well, I would be very interested in seeing the Marlon Brando, Barbra Streisand version for no other reason other than the idea that those two would have made a film together, because I mean they're known as two of the most difficult actors who have ever made a film, and the idea of both of them being in the same movie, I mean, that would have I'm sure somebody would have brought out a book on the making of the Gauntlet, and
there would be
behind the scenes horror stories that would have come out from that movie.
We'd have had another Disaster Artist, the James Franco one, where he's talking about making The Room. We would have a movie about making The Gauntlet. That would be insane, because for a fact Brando would insist on doing a particular accent and having a small pet with him the entire time. Yep. He'd be I think my character would have a squirrel. No, he wouldn't, Marlon. Let's stick to the script. No, I really think Detective Shockley would do well with a sugar glider in his pocket. No, we're not doing this, man.
Yeah, and Barbra Streisand, from what I understand, she was just as demanding when it came to wanting script approval and how scenes were going to be played. So yeah, I can well imagine there being, Barbra Streisand sort of marching into the director's trailer demanding that she wants changes. Meanwhile, Marlon Brando has decided, I need to travel to Guam so that I can workshop my character for 3 months before I come. So yeah, I would. Production probably would have been abandoned. It would be probably was a great lost filmic artifact out there. But yeah.
It would have
could have been.
Opportunity.
What could have been?
Yeah. Oh my God! Can you imagine Streisand kicking Brando in the groin because he slapped the hell out of her in a cave? That's like watching that footage from The Killers of Ronald Reagan just belting Dangy Dickinson in the face. That is just insane. Insane.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the action in this film. We've sort of already alluded to the fact that it is. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really. I mean, it's incredibly over the top, and obviously we're going to be talking about the exploding helicopter sequence later. But I mean, there are a couple of other very memorable standout scenes in this film. So there's obviously the siege at the house at Sandra Locke's house very early in the film, and then we get the big climax where Clint and Sandra drive into town in this bus that they've sort of turned into a battle bus with all those steel plates they've. I mean, I can remember when I first watched this movie, I was like, what the hell is happening now?
Yeah. And I knew I was in for something when they're in the ambulance and the ambulance driver sees a car on the side of the road. They pull over, ambulance driver gets out to get in the car, and then the car just explodes. And I'm like, oh, this is what we're doing now. Like, this is where we are for the rest of the film. And like you said, just driving a bus, and there's cops lined up, just firing and unloading every possible shot into this thing. And there's no pandemonium. It's almost like it's a normal thing for cops to just be lined up and shooting down vehicles. And I'm like, this is just, even by today's standards, it's a bit much.
I completely agree. I mean, it feels like a real oddity in the 1970s, this sort of excess. It feels like you would see this sort of, completely over-the-top excess would be much more at home in the 1980s. This feels like, as I say, a real oddity coming out in 1977 from that particular aspect. And I was thinking about something, though, that was interesting, potentially interesting, I guess, about this film in terms of the action and the violence that we see on screen, because I don't think Clint Eastwood, I don't think he actually shoots anyone in this film at all. Does he even fire his gun? I don't think he kills anybody.
He fires his gun when he's talking to the motorcycle gang, and the one guy's on the ground, and he shoots the gas tank on the motorcycle.
Yeah, but he doesn't shoot an actual person. And the only and then that is in contrast. What I thought was interesting was that is in contrast to the rest of the police force, like Clint Eastwood's colleagues, who just empty the entire police force's ammunition supply into Sandra Luck's house, and then later they empty like every bullet they've got in their gun belts into that bus, and they're just firing away mindlessly, like hundreds and hundreds of policemen, and all the rest of the police are sort of all portrayed as like being corrupt, uncaring, unthinking. There's just this complete sense of overkill, and I thought that was quite interesting. That contrast between Clint Eastwood and the rest of the police force, but also sort of interesting in the sense of, if you think of how often Clint Eastwood is probably playing that shoot first, ask questions later cop in those other police thrillers that he stars in, whereas here he's playing a character who doesn't actually shoot anyone.
Yeah, he really doesn't. Even on the train, he either punches them off the train or they kind of leave of their own volition. He's not really shooting, like you said, and then asking questions later. Because then it's like, but because it's like, why? What are they trying to prove?
Yes.
Is there like a secret
what's the point of that? What is the point? There is, and I can't think of a point. So it's like another example of this film sort of having half an idea, or having an idea but then never actually executing it. It's really bizarre.
I can understand if at some point he drinks himself to sleep and he has a flashback of maybe a hostage situation and he had his gun drawn ready to go and he didn't fire off a shot and some innocent person died and that's why he drinks. The guilt is overwhelming him. That would make total sense. Okay, we understand why he drinks a whole lot, and then we also understand why he's not shooting his gun. Like, it all kind of adds up, but it just doesn't happen. They just never address it, and I'm like, okay, like, yeah, what are we doing here? What are we doing here?
Yep, it remains a complete mystery. It remains a mystery. Okay, I think we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at the exploding helicopter action.
Framed for her family's murder.
Your assistant told me that they never found her body.
Her land ravished by corruption.
They brought in 3 professional killers.
For justice, one woman will stand alone.
They said you were dead.
Find her and you keep this thing contained. This is the woman, for Christ's sake. You're next.
Rachel McLish is Ravenhawk.
We're back, and now we're looking at the exploding helicopter action. Riding a motorcycle, Eastwood and Locke try to evade a couple of mafia sharpshooters who are pursuing them in a helicopter. The pair head cross-country in an effort to shake off the villains. Their path takes them down a hill that has a string of electricity pylons running across it. Now, it might seem a fairly simple task to avoid these easily observable hazards, but if Exploding Helicopters learned anything over the course of a long, unsuccessful podcasting career, it's to never underestimate the stupidity of a pilot. Sure enough, the villains, giddy at the prospect of being able to finally bump off Eastwood and Locke, fly too close to the pylons. The Whirlybird, a Sud Aviation SA-314B Gazelle, becomes entangled in wires, crashes to the ground and explodes. Nick, what did you make of the exploding helicopter action?
I thought this was great. I was so... When all of a sudden he's like, look out! I'm like, that's not how they go. As soon as they get tangled up in the wires and the explosion starts and everything, I'm like, this is it. We're going to see a huge explosion. But we don't. Instead, we start to see the thing like devolve and degrade and the fire and exploding. And even better, we get a shot from Clint Eastwood's point of view. Like, we see our main character watching the tragedy and what's going on with this helicopter in real time, in addition to all the other smoke and flames and then it falling out of the sky. It's a very elongated scene, which I was shocked about because I was expecting just boom, explosion, and they keep going. But for them to kind of stop and watch it and see everything as it unfolds, I was really impressed by that. And I really just kind of dug it because it's not something you see. You get almost a double explosion, and then it's kind of like going on the wires, and then it all just collapses. And I'm like, this is probably the most realistic thing in the movie, and it's also like one of the cooler explosions I've seen in like a long time, just because of how unique this situation is.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it so much, Nick. I mean, from what I understand of the making of the film, they certainly put time, effort, and energy into putting together this exploding helicopter sequence. So I understand that they actually built a replica helicopter that didn't have an engine in, so that it could, to sort of get the weight down, which they then used wires to then sort of winch it across into the pylons to create the scene that we get play out here. And from what you can read on online, this film had a $5 million budget, $1 million of which was spent on the special effects that we see in the film. That would, the number of squibs. I think this film holds potentially some sort of record for the number of squibs that are discharged in the making of this film. But yes, the other big action sequence of the exploding helicopter definitely seems to have eaten up a fair part of that special effects budget. But you enjoyed the manner of the destruction here. And I was consulting my records and racking my brains for other films where helicopters explode after crashing into pylons or crashing into electricity cables. And there is a Polish action film called Diablo, The Race for Everything, which features a helicopter crashing into a pylon. There's a 1973 TV movie called The Stranger, where the same thing happens again. And they're not electricity wires, but I can't quite remember what they are. There's like, I think it might be cables from some sort of Batmobile. Basically in the Dark Knight, a helicopter crashes after sort of getting caught up in cables that have been strung across the street. I can't quite remember. Oh
yeah, the tow cables that they shoot in order to catch it. I remember that now.
There you go. Thanks. You've filled in the blanks for me. Thanks,
okay.
Nick. So that's another scene where cables of electricity or otherwise have been employed in the destruction of a helicopter. So those are the four that I could think of that I could find. So not as we say, there's only three other examples. So not a very common form of helicopter destruction.
Would you count? I think it was when we watched Machete Kills when they take it out with a harpoon, because there's technically a cable on that. Would you count that, or would you count that more as like a gun, if you will, or some kind of like propulsive thing taking it down?
I think that I would count that more as a gun than a cable, because as you will remember, Nick, from your appearance on the Far Cry episode of the Exploding Helicopter podcast, where we saw a kind of like a harpoon type device employed in that exploding helicopter sequence, where they kind of shoots the cable down from, well, where has it? Well, I can't remember which way. I think it's fired up from the car into the helicopter. The cable then snaps, and then the cable then flies up into the rotor blades of the helicopter, causing it to then crash into the ocean. So I wouldn't count that in the same category. I would sort of see that more as a sort of like a weapons type of category.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay, well, I think that just about wraps things up for this show. Nick, thank you for joining me once again. Is there anything you'd like to plug before I drop you off at City Hall?
Absolutely. Check out rabbitholepodcast.com. You can find me on 2 shows there, Lyrical Innuendo, as well as the newer show I'm on, Play MST for Me, which is kind of funny because it's a play on Play Misty for Me, which I'm fairly certain was Clint Eastwood's directorial debut.
It was indeed. As always, don't forget to check out the Exploding Helicopter website for more information and reviews about films where helicopters explode. Give us a follow on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. We'll be back soon. But until then, what should people do, Nick?
Keep watching the skies for those exploding helicopters.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Well, does your wife know you masturbate?